Those in the Coleman Center, to those in Queens, where we are live streaming this evening. Welcome to you all, and particularly, of course, welcome to Noam, as we know him, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky needs no introduction, so I'll be very, very brief. He's, of course, probably the one academic who is known throughout the world for his scholarship and public engagement. Currently Emeritus Professor in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at MIT, Noam was born in Philadelphia in 1928 and has worked for nearly all his career at one institution where he started in 1955, there's loyalty, MIT. Sometimes described as the father of linguistics, he is also a major figure in the philosophy of mind, language, politics, and ethics. He was named the world's top public intellectual by one poll, but we hardly needed reminding. Noam has written over 100 books and has made massive contributions, of course, to the fields in which he's engaged. For years, he's been one of the most prominently cited academics. He has lectured in many of the most prominent lecture series of the world, and now he can add the Durham Castle lecture series to his list. His list of awards and honors is extraordinary, and one hardly knows where to start. I counted honorary degrees from at least 38 of the most distinguished universities in the world. In Germany, this would be a nightmare because of the tradition and convention of introducing important speakers by all of their degrees. So it would be welcome, Herr Professor, Doctor, till you get to 38. Among his most impressive honors, at least impressive to me, that I could find, was a newly described species of bee that has been named after him. His talk, Surviving the 21st Century, will be for about 35-40 minutes or so, and then we will take questions from here and also from the other lecture theatres, which will somehow arrive on my iPad. Again, to remind you, hashtag Chomsky, if you wish to tweet. It's an incredible pleasure to have you here, and please join with me in giving Noam Chomsky a better welcome than he's ever had before.
When I think about the announced title, Will We Survive the 21st Century? There is an irresistible image. It's the image of the proverbial lemmings marching towards the cliff, cheering their intrepid leaders. As we should all be aware, for the first time in history, humans are now poised to destroy the prospects for decent existence and much of life. The rate of species destruction right now is about at the level of 65 million years ago, when a huge asteroid hit the Earth, ended the age of the dinosaurs, opened the way for the proliferation of mammals. The difference is that today we're the asteroid, and the way may well be open to beetles and bacteria when we've concluded our work. Geologists break the history of the planet into eras of relative stability. The Pleistocene lasted several million years, followed by the Holocene about 10,000 years ago that coincided with the introduction of agriculture. And now geologists are adding a new era, a new epoch, the Anthropocene, beginning with the Industrial Revolution roughly 200 years ago. And it has radically changed the natural world. In the light of the pace of change, one hates to think about when the next epoch will begin and what it'll be. One effect of the Anthropocene is the extraordinary rate of species extinction. Another is the threat to ourselves. No literate person can fail to be aware that we're facing a prospect of severe environmental disaster, effects that are already detectable, And that might become dire within a few generations if current tendencies are not reversed. Just to give a few examples, a couple of weeks ago, 2 leading scientific journals published a new study of the West Antarctic ice sheet. It's long been understood that if it collapses, it will lead almost inevitably to a rise in global sea level of at least 10 feet within a few generations, wipes out civilization in any recognizable form. The reports, the new studies reported that it is collapsing. Leading scientists who are familiar with the study warn that continued release of greenhouse gases will almost certainly make the situation worse, destabilizing other parts of Antarctica as well as the Greenland ice sheet, causing many of the world's coastal cities to be abandoned, with horrifying consequences for the poor inhabitants of coastal plains, and probably millions in Bangladesh alone. The leading U.S. scientific society, the AAAS, which is usually quite conservative, did issue a study a few days earlier reporting, quoting it, the overwhelming evidence of human-caused climate change with both current impacts and extraordinary future risks to society and natural systems. The report expressed particular concern over, quoting again, the disconnect between scientific knowledge and public perception. They're talking about the United States. And that's not an accident. Leading sectors of the business world are quite openly running major propaganda campaigns to convince the public that humans are not responsible for global warming if it's occurring at all. Some of the leading business journals, like the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, responded to the latest IPCC report with articles saying that the real problem is global cooling. And there's some effect. There are recent studies that show, polling studies that show that concern about global warming in the United States is well below the global norm, and it's stratified. Among Republicans, it's far below the global norm. Among Democrats, slightly below. And that's not untypical of the contemporary Republican Party, which is no longer a conventional parliamentary party. There's a more accurate description that was given by one of the very few remaining genuine conservatives, the respected political analyst of the right-wing American Enterprise Institute, Norman Ornstein. He describes the former Republican Party as a radical insurgency which has pretty much abandoned the domain of parliamentary politics. And although he didn't add this, we can say that the reason is that's in virtual lockstep service to extreme wealth and privilege. And one aspect of this is denial of climate change, or at least the human role in this terrifying development. The current issue of the premier journal of media criticism, the Columbia Journalism Review, has an interesting article about this topic. It attributes this outcome to a media doctrine that's called fair and balanced. Thus, if a journal publishes an opinion piece reflecting the opinion of 97% of scientists, it has to run alongside it a piece, counterpiece expressing the claims of the energy corporations, so the public ends up confused. And that is indeed what happens, but there's certainly no doctrine of fair and balanced. Thus, if a journal, say, runs an opinion piece denouncing Putin once again for the criminal act of taking over Crimea, it surely does not have to run a piece alongside it, pointing out that while this act is indeed criminal, Russia has a far stronger case than the U.S. does in having taken over southeastern Cuba over 100 years ago, including Cuba's major port, rejecting the demand of Cuba since independence to have it returned with no justification at all, unlike the Russians, only the justification that this contributes to the 50-year program of terrorist warfare, which was quite extreme, and economic strangulation of Cuba. And there are quite a few other current cases, but they don't have to be mentioned under the doctrine of fair and balanced. There is an actual media doctrine. It has to be fair and balanced when the concerns of concentrated private power are involved, surely not elsewhere. But although obvious enough, this cannot be perceived in the elite culture, so it appears. There's now much exuberance in the United States about what's called 100 years of energy independence lying ahead as we become the Saudi Arabia of the next century. President Obama orated about the matter with his usual eloquence 2 years ago. I'll quote him. He proclaimed with pride to ample applause that now under my administration, America is producing more oil than at any time in the last 8 years. That's important to know. Over the past 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new oil and gas pipeline to encircle the earth, and then some. Uplifting. The applause tells us something important about our social and moral malaise. The president was speaking in Cushing, Oklahoma. That's an oil town, as he announced in greeting his appreciative audience. In fact, it's the oil town. It's described as the most significant trading hub for crude oil in North America. And industry profits are sure to be secured in the short term as producing more oil and gas here at home, and the president's words, will continue to be a critical part of energy strategy, as the president promised. Let's go to the media. A couple of weeks ago, the New York Times published an energy supplement, 8 pages, mostly euphoria about the bright future for the United States, poised to be the greatest producer of fossil fuels. And missing in the 8 pages is any reflection on what kind of world we're exuberantly creating. One might recall George Orwell's observation in his unpublished introduction to Animal Farm about how in free England ideas can be suppressed without the use of force, not least because immersion in the elite culture, having a good education, instills the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say, or we can add even to think. In the moral calculus of contemporary Anglo-American state capitalism, profits and bonuses in the next quarter that greatly outweigh concern for the welfare of one's grandchildren. While much remains uncertain, we can assure ourselves with fair confidence that future generations will not forgive us for our silence and our apathy. We might, in fact, wish to consider a remarkable paradox of the current era. There are some who are devoting themselves seriously to try to avert impending disaster. In the lead are the most oppressed segments of the global population, those considered to be the most backward and primitive, the indigenous societies of the world, First Nations in Canada, Aboriginals in Australia, tribal people in India, and others like them. And in countries with influential indigenous populations like Bolivia and Ecuador, there are by now even legislative proposals, legislative recognition of rights of nature. The government of Ecuador actually proposed to leave their supplies of oil in the ground where they should be if the European countries would provide them development aid amounting to a small fraction of what they would sacrifice by not exploiting their oil resources. And of course, the European countries refused. They didn't bother asking the United States. While indigenous people are trying to avert the disaster, in sharp contrast, the race to the cliff is led by the most advanced, educated, wealthy, privileged societies in the world, notably North America, others not far behind, few exceptions like Germany, but not many. Unless there's a significant change of course, and soon, the prospect for decent survival is quite slim. And that's not all. For the past 70 years, we've been living under the threat of instant and virtually total destruction at our own hands. Those familiar with the shocking record, and if you're not familiar with it, I'd urge looking at it, but those familiar with it, and the record continues to the present, would find it hard to contest the conclusions of General Lee Butler. He's the last commander of the Strategic Air Command, which has responsibility for nuclear weapons. He writes that we have so far survived the nuclear age by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in the greatest proportion. It's actually a near miracle that we've escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to save us from our folly. In this context, it's worth taking a close look at the factors that drive policy. There is a received standard version. It's common to academic, scholarly discourse, public discourse, diplomatic commentary. So I'll just quote a few leading figures, but it's almost universal. Take, say, George Kennan, one of the creators of the modern world. According to him, government is created to assure order and justice internally and to provide for the common defense. Coming to the present and the current issue of the journal National Interest, leading realist scholar John Mearsheimer formulates the doctrine as holding that the structure of the international system forces countries concerned about their security to compete with each other for power. Leading scholar of U.S. Middle East policy, William Quandt, also long diplomatic experience, writes that the driving force of U.S. policy is to ensure security and well-being of the population, and so on, pretty much endlessly. We can put aside the standard pieties about justice and well-being of the population. What is emphasized throughout is concern for security, which sounds plausible enough, but there's a few unanswered questions. For example, security for whom? Well, one answer is security for state power. Now, there are many illustrations of that. So take a current one from a couple of days ago. The United States agreed, and this is unusual, to support a Security Council resolution calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate war crimes in Syria. But there was a proviso. No inquiry will be tolerated into possible war crimes by Israel or, of course, by the United States. That's the explicit proviso, and it's routine. The United States is uniquely self-immunized from the international legal system. It's a very interesting topic. I don't have time to pursue it, but it does illustrate the importance of protecting the security of the state, security of state power. To protect the security of state power from whom? Well, enemies, of course, but who are the enemies? It turns out that one prime enemy is the domestic population. That fact is demonstrated over and over very clearly recently, very clearly quite generally by government secrecy, as it very rarely has a genuine security motivation. That much should be familiar to anyone who's plowed through declassified documents. You almost never find anything related to genuine security. But there is an effect. The effect is to keep the population in the dark, the enemy. They have to make sure they don't know what's going on. And there are good reasons. Some of these were explained by the professor of the science of government. I always liked that title. The professor of the science of government at Harvard, Samuel Huntington, prominent liberal scholar, government advisor. He instructs us that the architects of power in the United States must create a force that can be felt but not seen. Power remains strong when it remains in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. That was in 1981, when the Cold War was again heating up. And Huntington went on to explain that you may have to sell intervention or other military action in such a way as to create the misimpression that it's the Soviet Union that you're fighting. That's what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine of 1947. 1981 was another critical year in this regard. It was the year when Reagan declared the first war on terror, plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time, etc., etc. And ever since then, particularly after the disappearance of the Russian threat, or temporary disappearance as a concocted ogre, terror. You have to create the misimpression that it's terror that you're fighting. There are other candidates, narco-traffickers, crazed mullahs, and a number of others. All of this is rarely acknowledged, but it's very accurate, and it's a good insight into state power and policy. Has plenty of reverberations right to the present moment. So state power surely has to be secured from dangerous enemies like the domestic population. But in sharp contrast, the public is not secure from state power. There's a very striking illustration of that right now. President Obama's current radical attack on the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which, to quote it, protects citizens from unreasonable search and seizure, protects the privacy of their persons, homes, papers, and effects. The defense of this right in Boston helped spark the American Revolution. That's why it was written into the Constitution, into the Bill of Rights. At that time, the tyrant was the British government, and now the tyrant is the American government. Of course, referring to the extraordinary surveillance campaign, Obama's surveillance campaign, which seeks to monitor everything without exception that you say or do, and anyone connected in any way to the electronic culture, cell phone, computer, landline, is vulnerable to this inquiry. And Britain agrees. The government remains tyrannical. The British government, as perhaps you know, authorized the United States National Security Agency, actually requested it, in quotes, to analyze and retain any British citizen's mobile phone and fax numbers, emails, and IP addresses that are swept up in the NSA dragnet, which is colossal, picks up essentially everything. You should also be happy to know that the NSA routinely receives or intercepts routers, servers, computers, other computer network devices that are being exported from the United States so that it can implant surveillance tools, make sure that the NSA knows every keystroke you're making. And presumably China does the same, which kind of exhausts the range. All of this is justified by security in accord with the standard doctrine. But it's worth remembering that the claim of justification for security carries no information whatsoever, literally, even in the technical sense. It's completely predictable for virtually all actions of states when they're caught in some crime or malfeasance. And if something's perfectly predictable, it simply carries no information. In the case of the Snowden revelations, the first reaction of the U.S. government was the reflexive one, security. The president, the head of the NSA, informed the public that numerous terrorist plots were stopped by these surveillance methods. And the first claim was 54 were stopped. And that was later reduced to a dozen. There was later a government commission established which investigated exactly how many had been stopped, and it turned out there was one. Somebody sent $8,500 to Somalia. That, so far, is the total yield of this colossal effort to monitor and control the population, the domestic enemy. There is another concern, security for private power. Major current illustration are the huge trade agreements that are now being negotiated, Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic. They're secret, but not completely. They're not secret to the hundreds of corporate lawyers and lobbyists who are writing the detailed regulations. You can guess what they are and why they're secret. There are other illustrations throughout the Snowden documents. One of the interesting parts of them is that they reveal extensive economic espionage in the interests of U.S. corporations. Actually, when this is brought to the attention of the government, they say, well, we don't choose particular corporations, which is correct. It's just the general corporate sector that has to be, whose security must be protected by state intervention. Well, there are other examples. They're actually too numerous to mention, and they shouldn't be surprising. Actually, there's a recent study just came out from Princeton University to leading political scientists, Martin Gilens, Benjamin Page, who studied hundreds of policy decisions and conclude with very careful analysis, I'll quote, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy, while average citizens and mass-based interest groups have little or no independent influence. These results, they say, provide substantial support for theories of economic elite domination and for theories of biased pluralism, but not for theories of majoritarian electoral democracy or majoritarian pluralism. To put it simply, it's a pretense that we live in democracies. They're plutocracies. Other work by these and other scholars, particularly Martin Gilens, has shown pretty convincingly that in the United States, about 70% of the population, the lower 70% on the income scale, have no influence at all on policy. That's one of the reasons why most of them don't vote. Why bother? Doesn't matter what they think. As you move up the scale, you get a little more influence. And at the very top, which means a fraction of 1%, basically that's where policy is written. So it's not surprising that the security of private interest is a major commitment of the state. And this goes way back. There's nothing new about it. It's getting kind of grotesque by now, but it goes far back. The closest, most careful inquiry into this is done by a very good political scientist, Thomas Ferguson, University of Massachusetts. He studied the effect of the relation between campaign spending and policy choices back into the 19th century. And it turns out it's an extremely good predictor. You take a look at the distribution of campaign spending, you can pretty well predict the policies that will be enacted. This runs right through the New Deal, has very few exceptions. Actually, there was over a century ago, the most prominent in American history, the most prominent campaign manager, Mark Hanna, around the turn of the 19th century, was asked, what are the most important things that are necessary for running a campaign? And he said there are three. The first one's money. The second one's money. And I've forgotten what the third one is. That was well over 100 years ago. Now it's well beyond. Nevertheless, it's useful to have a new and very careful confirmation by Gillens and Page of facts that are so obvious that in a free society they'd be taught in elementary school. Well, the United States is actually an unusually free and open society in a number of respects, crucial ones. And one of them, relevant here, is the accessibility of internal state records, secret records, declassified. And they provide a very revealing account of the actual motives of state policy. Fortunately, no time to review the matter here, but there are a few persistent themes. We find consistently that one major driving factor in policy choices is concern about what Henry Kissinger called viruses that spread contagion. He was referring specifically to Allende's Chile, which threatened to spread the contagion of a peaceful parliamentary path towards independent development and social welfare. You know the outcome in that case. And it's duplicated in case after case throughout Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. It's the most prominent theme of Cold War history. In general, there's ample evidence that security of state power, crucially security from the population, and security of concentrated economic power, private power, that these are driving forces in policy formation. Furthermore, that's entirely natural and to be expected when you look into how policy is formulated. Of course, it's not quite that simple. There are some interesting cases, some quite current, in fact, when these commitments conflict. It's interesting to see what happens in those cases. But this is an extremely good first approximation and radically opposed to the received standard doctrine, what you're taught and what you read. Well, let's turn to another question. What about security of the population? It's very easy to demonstrate that this is at most a marginal concern of policy planners. So take two very prominent examples, two I mentioned, global warming and nuclear weapons, both dire threats to the security of the population. Turn to state policy. In both cases, it systematically attempts to accelerate the threat in the interests of its primary concerns, protection of state power and protection of concentrated private power, namely the power that largely determines state policy. In the case of global warming, the conclusion is too obvious even to tarry on, so I'll drop it. But it's quite instructive to see that even instant destruction by nuclear weapons has never ranked high among the concerns of state authorities. Now, the record reveals that quite clearly. Let me run through a few examples. Start in the early days of the atomic age, around 1950. At that time, the United States was overwhelmingly powerful and enjoyed remarkable security. There was nothing like it in history. It controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had half the world's wealth, just incomparable power and security. Actually, there was a potential threat, ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. They didn't exist at the time, but it was a potential threat. There is a standard scholarly review of nuclear policies. It's undertaken access to high-level sources, declassified documents, by McGeorge Bundy. He was the National Security Advisor for Kennedy and Johnson administration's former Harvard dean. And he writes that, I'll quote him, "The timely development of ballistic missiles during the Eisenhower administration, the 50s, is one of the best achievements of those 8 years. Yet it is well to begin with a recognition that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if these missiles had never been developed." And he then adds an instructive comment. He says, "I am aware of no serious contemporary proposal in or out of government that ballistic missiles should somehow be banned by agreement." So in short, there was apparently no thought of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, the threat of instant, utter destruction. And this striking fact merits barely a phrase in this massive, standard, comprehensive history, and it's also passed unnoticed. Well, could it have been prevented? Can't be sure, of course, but there are some indications that it might have been possible. One suggestive indication is a remarkable proposal by Stalin in 1952. He offered to permit Germany to be unified with free elections, which of course the communists would lose, but on condition, one condition, that it not join a hostile military alliance. That's hardly an extreme condition if you look at the history of the preceding half-century. Stalin's proposal was ignored or ridiculed, but recent scholarship has begun to take a different view, especially with the release of the Russian archival records. There's a bitterly anti-communist Harvard scholar, late Adam Ulam, specialist on the Bolshevik period. He takes the status of Stalin's proposal to be an unresolved mystery. He writes that Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, East Germany, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and for American security that would have been enormous? That remains an open question. One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, has reviewed recent research in Soviet archives, and he writes that many scholars, including him, were surprised to discover that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions, and, of course, for them, improve internal political and economic conditions, opportunities that were squandered by the West in favor of securing West German participation in NATO. Under the circumstances, actual circumstances, not the propaganda ones, it's not impossible that agreements might have been reached that would have protected the security of the population from the gravest threat on the horizon, instant total destruction. But the option, the possibility, was apparently not considered, recognized, but dismissed or ridiculed. It's another indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy, contrary to standard doctrine. And actually, that was revealed again repeatedly in the years that followed. A couple of years later, Nikita Khrushchev took office. He understood that Russia could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest, most powerful country in history, incomparable advantages. If Russia hoped to escape its economic backwardness and the devastating effect of the Second World War, he concluded it would be necessary to sharply reverse the arms race. And he, in fact, proposed sharp mutual reduction in offensive nuclear weapons. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it. It turned instead to rapid military expansion. There's a review of this by one of the most respected IR international relations scholars, Kenneth Waltz, recently died. He wrote that the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has ever seen, even as Khrushchev was trying at once to carry out a major reduction in the conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we, the United States, did so, even though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, decisions that harm national security, harm the security of the people, while enhancing state power. Kennedy, as you may recall, barely squeaked to victory in 1960 in the election, mainly by fraud. But one of the ways he squeaked to victory was his charge that the opponent, Eisenhower and Nixon, had permitted the Russians to leap ahead in offensive weaponry, creating what was called a missile gap that severely threatened U.S. security, and that frightened the population. The reality was that the United States was far in the lead. The Russians actually had 4 operational ICBMs, which were exposed to attack, tiny fraction of the U.S. arsenal. That was recognized by the Kennedy administration. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor, speaking for the administration, he explained that they had nevertheless been right in emphasizing a fake missile gap. And the reason he gave was that the phrase had a useful shorthand effect of calling attention to our basic military posture, namely the posture of rapidly expanding the overwhelming U.S. dominance and threat while rejecting security and the prospects for survival. Normal. There was a Soviet reaction. It was to place missiles in Cuba in October 1962. That move was motivated as well by Kennedy's quite immense, a huge terrorist campaign against Cuba. It was very serious, and it was scheduled to lead to invasion in October 1962, as Russia and Cuba may well have known. That brought us to what historian Arthur Schlesinger called the most dangerous moment in history, and it was extremely dangerous. The crisis peaked in late October 1962, October 26th, 27th. Kennedy then received a letter, a secret letter from Khrushchev, offering to end the crisis by simultaneous public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These were obsolete missiles for which a withdrawal order had already been given because they were being replaced by much more dangerous and, at the time, invulnerable Polaris submarines. So that was the offer. Russia would remove the missiles from Cuba. The U.S. would continue to remove missiles which are already being withdrawn because they're being replaced by more dangerous ones. Kennedy's subjective estimate was that if he refused, the probability of nuclear war would be a third to a half. That's a war that would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, according to Eisenhower, President Eisenhower's warning. Kennedy refused. It's hard to think of a more horrendous decision in history. And worse, he's greatly praised for it, for his cool courage, his statesmanship. 10 years later, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert. It was the last days of the 1973 Israel-Arab War, and there was a purpose. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomacy. He was carrying out delicate diplomatic maneuvers which were designed to ensure an Israeli victory in the war, but a limited victory, so that the United States would still remain in total control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were delicate. The United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger, turns out, had secretly informed Israel that they could ignore the ceasefire. Therefore, there was a need to call a nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away. The security of the population had its usual status, 0. 10 years after that, the Reagan administration came in and they launched operations to probe Russian air defenses. That meant simulating air and naval attacks, calling the highest level nuclear alert into Russian waters and territory. And these were taken at a very tense moment. Right at that time, Pershing II strategic missiles were being deployed in Europe, a few minutes flight time to Moscow. Reagan had announced the Star Wars program, SDI, which the Russians understood to be effectively a first strike weapon. That's a standard interpretation of so-called missile defense on all sides. And other tensions were rising. Well, naturally, these actions caused considerable alarm in Russia. Unlike the United States, Russia is quite vulnerable, repeatedly been invaded and practically destroyed. Actually, that led to a major war scare in 1983. Newly released archives, Russian archives, reveal that the danger was much more severe even than historians of the nuclear interactions had previously assumed. There's a recent CIA study which is called "The War Scare Was for Real." It concluded that U.S. intelligence had underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian reaction. These exercises, I'm quoting, almost became a prelude to a preventative nuclear strike, an account in the recent issue of the Journal of Strategic Studies. And it turns out it was even more dangerous than that. We learned that last September. The BBC reported that right in the midst of these really world-threatening developments, Russia's early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, sending off the highest level automated alert. There's a protocol for Soviet military, same with the U.S., and that is to retaliate at once with a nuclear attack of its own. Can't wait any longer. There was an officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, and he decided to disobey the orders and not to report the warning to his superiors. He received an official reprimand, and thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're around to talk about it. Security of the population was no more a priority for Reagan planners than for their predecessors. And that continues until the present, even putting aside the numerous near catastrophic accidents, which are really quite shocking. They're reviewed in a chilling new book by Eric Schlosser. Plans for the future are hardly promising. U.S. Congressional Budget Office just reported that the U.S. nuclear arsenal will cost $350 billion over the next decade, and that costs of expanding and modernizing it will quadruple from 1924 to 1930. There's a detailed study by the Center for Non-Proliferation of the Monterey Institute for International Studies estimated that the U.S. will spend $1 trillion on the nuclear arsenal in the next 30 years. As they put it, that's a percentage of the military budget comparable to spending for procurement of new strategic systems in the 1980s under President Ronald Reagan. And of course, the U.S. is not alone. As General Butler observed, it's a near miracle that we've escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to perpetuate the miracle. In the background is a legal obligation, as determined by the World Court, that the nuclear powers undertake good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. But that's far in the background. Legal obligations are not for the powerful. This review only scratches the surface. There are numerous other ways to evaluate the conventional doctrines about the goals of policy, the forces that shape policy decisions. I think if you inquire into them, and it's quite worth doing, you'll find that they converge in the conclusions that I just mentioned. Quote Gillens and Page again, policy is largely set by economic elites and organized groups representing business interests with little concerns for public attitudes or public safety, as long as the public remains passive and obedient, frightened by concocted ogres. Security is, to be sure, a prime concern. Security of power and profit, not security of the population, marginal concern. These have never been small problems, and that's particularly true right now. So let me end by stressing again that what we should all know very well, that we now face the most ominous decisions in human history. Now, there are many problems of the world, but two are overwhelming in their significance: environmental destruction and nuclear war. For the first time in history, we face the prospects of destroying the possibility for decent existence, and not in the distant future. And for this reason alone, it's imperative to sweep away the ideological clouds, face honestly and realistically the question of how policy decisions are made in our societies and what we can do to alter them before it's too late. Thanks.
Well, now to you all. I'd like to take questions in clusters of three so that we can get a few remarks out. I'll take three from the Great Hall now before we go to other lecture theatres and bring them in. So do I see any hands? We have a roaming mic and you'll need it. So there's a gentleman at the back there.
Sorry. Hi, Mr. Chomsky. Paris Katsinas, on behalf of the Greek Editors Journal and on behalf of the ex-Greek BBC. I had many questions to ask you.
Can you put the mic just
do I need to
away from your
away
mouth?
from me? Sorry for the feedback. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Thank you. I had many questions to ask you.
One.
One, yes.
One
yes.
short one.
Just one. But I chose one. Many people told me to ask you, but I chose the question of a 55-year-old doorman. He works in the doors here in the clubs in Newcastle. It's a very simple question, and I would like your answer, please, sir. And this gentleman asked me, why politicians lie?
Okay, well, that's a straightforward question. Why politicians lie? Yes, we'll come back to that rather brutal question. Let's just take from the back. Anyone? Let's go right to the back.
Thank you, Dr. Chomsky. You talked quite a bit about how governments seek to perpetuate their own power, even if it's directly against the interests of their own people. And you listed a bunch of examples about how the US government has done so through expanding militarily. How important do you feel is a military-industrial complex whereby private corporations seek to expand and provide military equipment to the government? How important do you feel that is in causing this problem?
Do you have that question? Yeah, okay. We'll move on. It's all men so far. Surely we can do better than that. Yeah, come down here.
I was wondering, you talked about the role of the media in sort of perpetuating a gap between public knowledge and scientific knowledge. And I wondered if you thought that, the growing force of the internet and the power of any person to reach a worldwide audience might do something to negate that and to try and improve that and sort of narrow that gap.
Do you want to put that into a short question? Go on.
I wondered if you thought that through the internet, people might be able to narrow the gap between scientific knowledge and public knowledge.
Can the internet narrow the gap between, ideology and knowledge, as it were? All right, let's take those three to begin with.
Well, I think that that relates to the first question, why politicians lie. The simple answer is because we let them. We have the power to prevent it. But if you don't use the power, if you sit back and say, I don't care, then they'll lie. And they have good reasons to. I mean, would it make sense for Tony Blair, say, to stand up now and say, please set up a war crimes tribunal to try me for the supreme international crime of aggression? Would that make sense? Or for him to say, please throw me out of my position as a special representative for the Middle East Quartet because I'm doing absolutely nothing for peace but enriching myself? Or would it make sense for, and you can run down the line. Now, there's very good reasons either to lie or just not to tell the truth. If politicians told the truth, I think, you decide for yourselves, I think they would be saying what I was just talking about. They would be saying, we don't care at all about your security or your safety or your survival. We care about our power and about the power of the concentrated domestic power, which in our societies means basically the corporate sector. Now, it's not 100% the case, of course, but it will be, there's a strong tendency for it to be the case for the people who reach the top. That's how they reach the top. But the real answer is we let them. And that's up to, we're talking about ourselves now. Good to look into the mirror. Can the internet help? It's one of the ways in which the general population can try to counter the extraordinary power of mostly concentrated economic power. But again, only if you use it. And you could say this, it's true whether there's an internet or not. The internet does offer some new options. It also offers new options for controlling and suppressing. Technology pretty much tends to be neutral. You can use it to liberate, you can use it to oppress, and the answer to which happens is in our hands. The military-industrial complex, that's, of course, Eisenhower's phrase. Interestingly, his phrase when he left office, after having created, through his 8 years, a huge military-industrial complex, I can't honestly complain about it. That's one of the reasons I have a job. I teach at MIT, which is right at the center of it. 1950s and 60s, practically the whole academic budget was paid by the Pentagon. But that tells you something. There was almost no military work. In fact, the only military work on campus was in the political science department. The political science department had something called a Peace Research Institute. And anyone who read Orwell knows exactly what that means. It was an institute working on counterinsurgency in Vietnam and other such benign actions. But outside the political science department, there was no military work on campus. But it was funded by the Pentagon. And that tells you something about the Pentagon and the so-called military-industrial complex that is kept quiet. The Pentagon in the United States and comparable systems here and elsewhere are, they have a military function, but they also have another function. They create the economy of the future. They are systems by which taxpayers are misled, as Huntington said. You have to create misimpressions. Taxpayers are misled to create the profits of corporations for the future. Most of you have, say, iPhones or something like that in your pocket. Take a look at them. For example, they have in them a GPS. Where'd the GPS come from? It was created by the U.S. Navy, the Navistar program. It has microelectronics, software, hardware, almost all created for decades, mostly in the state sector, often in the U.S. Pentagon funding, here the counterpart. Taxpayers pay for this because they think they're protecting their security. That's what they're told. But in fact, the government doesn't care about your security. What it cares is about its own power and security for corporate power. And the way the system works is the taxpayer takes the risks, carries out the investment for decades, literally decades. Finally, something may come out which is profitable, and then the profit goes to the private sector. If we had anything remotely like capitalist systems, we don't. They would adhere to the capitalist principle that if an investor takes risks and invests and waits and takes risky steps, and if something comes out of it, the profit goes back to the investor. That's not the way it works here. The profit goes to people who had nothing to do with it. The risks are taken by you, often through the Pentagon and comparable systems, and if anything comes out, the profits go to Microsoft and Apple. Now, they didn't create it. They take it. It's given to them. And it literally is decades. So computers were the computer market, personal computer market, became viable in 1977, I think it was. Apple was the first. That was about 30 years after the development of computers, almost all in the state sector, like in the building where I work. And if you buy pharmaceuticals, let's say, the basic research and development is pretty much done in the state sector. Places like probably the biology lab right here probably gets government funding, grants. And that's all across the board. When you look back at these, I mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership. One part of that was leaked by WikiLeaks. It's secret except for the corporate lawyers and lobbyists. But one part was leaked. It was the part on intellectual property. Intellectual property is a polite term, a kind of a euphemism for government instituted monopoly pricing rights. That's what it really means. It means extraordinarily high patent rights, which have never existed in history, for the pharmaceutical corporations and some other corporations. That's to keep the price of drugs up and make profits astronomical. Now there's a pretext. The pharmaceutical corporations say, look, we need that for research and development. That's been investigated. Turns out that probably at least half of the R&D is not done by the pharmaceutical corporations at all. It's done by the state sector and so on. And that's an underestimate, because if you take a close look, the part that's done by the pharmaceutical corporations is towards the marketing end, like, flip around a molecule to get a new drug. But the basic research, the hard, costly, risky research, that's done by people like you. You pay for it through your taxes. And the pharmaceutical corporations rip off the profit. Actually, there is a study one study by a very good American economist, Dean Baker, who estimated what would happen if R&D was 100% funded by the public and the pharmaceutical corporations were compelled to go on the market to sell what they produce. It turns out there'd be a colossal saving for the public, and of course a sharp reduction in profits of the big industries. That's intellectual property. That's the part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was leaked. But going back to the military-industrial complex, it's a kind of misleading term. It really refers to most of the advanced economy, which in our societies is substantially state-based. And incidentally, that goes back hundreds of years. You take a look at British economic development, it wasn't through the market. It was through powerful state intervention. Same with the United States, same with Germany, Japan, France, every developed society, Asian tigers, and so on.
Well, we have a few questions already from elsewhere, so I'll just edit them. Apologies to those whose questions are not read out. You'll get this quite quickly. How long before the chickens come home to roost is one question. Another one is, the late Robert Dahl argued that we live in a polyarchy, not a democracy. Do you agree? And the final question I will mention here is that the IPCC wrote recently that climate change mitigation is unachievable if individual agents advance their own interests independently. Do you agree? Well, we know the answer to that question, but I'll say it anyway.
Well, the first and the third question are pretty similar. According to the IPCC, the studies that have followed it, I quoted a couple of them. The chickens are coming home to roost already, and it's going to be pretty serious within a generation or two. Very serious. I mean, just imagine what a 10-foot rise in sea level would be. Most cities would be gone. The real danger, the catastrophe, would be for the poor, as always. So Bangladesh, for example, is a coastal plain. There's millions, tens of millions of people will be wiped out. What kind of civilization could survive a rise of 10 feet in sea level? Just ask yourselves. And that's within sight. Your grandchildren. It's not that far. Is a change achievable? Technically, yes. But is it feasible is the question. And whether it's feasible or not goes back to your decisions. Will people make decisions that will do what ought to be done? Most of the fossil fuels ought to stay in the ground, just as Ecuador proposed. And efforts should be made to develop alternatives. Now, that's not inconceivable. I mentioned Germany. Germany's on a path to get to about 70% sustainable energy within a short term. Now, that might be impeded. If you read the U.S. business press, they're very excited now about the fact that thanks to enormous use of fossil fuels in the United States, energy prices are going down in the United States, and that'll make European manufacturing uncompetitive, and therefore Europe will have to back off on its conservation measures. That's a great thing, because then we'll make even more profit, and the steps that are taken towards saving our grandchildren will be dropped off. That is the moral calculus of Anglo-American state capitalism. We should recognize that. But it is technically feasible. There are all sorts of other possibilities that can be exploited, but not without decisions. And if decisions are left in the hands of state and private power, there is no reason to expect any amelioration of this. It's just getting worse, like the quotes from Obama that I read. Polyarchy. Polyarchy is it's kind of I think Dal is basically right, but why not simply say it? It's a plutocracy. The very rich make decisions in their own interests, and most of the population is irrelevant. Actually, it's worse in Europe than in the United States. Europe, what's happened in Europe in the past 10 or 20 years is just astonishing. I mean, even the Wall Street Journal is astonished. They pointed out recently in an article that, which is correct, that in Europe, no matter what government is elected, far left, far right, anything else, they follow exactly the same policies because they have no role in setting policy. The policies are set by the bureaucrats in Brussels under the shadow of the Bundesbank. So it doesn't matter what people think. In fact, there are some dramatic illustrations of that. A couple of years ago, the Greek Prime Minister, Papandreou, meekly suggested that maybe there should be a referendum in Greece so that people could say whether they wanted to accept the policies that were being dictated to them. He was denounced across the spectrum. Everybody denounced him as totally crazy. Now, how can you dare ask the population what policies ought to be? In Europe, we know that policies have to be set by the bureaucrats and the bankers. Polyarchy isn't really the right term for that.
Are you okay for one more round of questions? All right, let's just see what we can find. It's very difficult. Lady just there. I'm afraid my choices are going to be pretty arbitrary.
Thank you. My question's about your final statement. You said something like, we have to face our two major problems and consider what we can do to avoid destruction. Think about what we can do. What would you advise we do when we leave this room? Because I feel quite depressed.
Leave this room. What would you advise?
Practically.
Yes. Given what you have talked about and the imminence, this century, as it were, of disaster, what would you advise people to do? All right. Let's go over there.
You mentioned that the richest countries in the world are amongst those who most disregard the true security of their people, in place of the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. However, it could be argued that the poorest countries in the world are doing exactly the same thing. How can we explain these differences in fortune, given that each seems to pursue similar policy strategies? And is it a question of balance?
Do you want to put that in a slightly simpler way? Don't read it, just say it.
I didn't get the last part.
The richest and the poorest countries in the world each seem to disregard the true security of their people, yet they seem to experience completely different fortunes. How can we explain this?
Yeah. Is that clearer? Good. Let's just try and take a few more, because this will be the last cluster. Go on, Richard, at random.
In your talk, you talked mainly about the US and about Europe, but what do you think about the rise of China in terms of, the future of the human race, etc.?
All right. I think I'll just take one last question over there, and then we'll have to stop. Richard, just over here in the corner.
Can I ask you a personal ethical question? how do you square having your views with working in MIT?
Oh, that's easy. All right, but as a PhD, since I got my PhD from MIT, declare a conflict of interest here, I've got a last question for you, which is this. How do you imagine democracy, the shape and form of a democracy that would be open, pluralist, responsive? It would have to be a very different kind of democracy to standard electoral, short-term competitive democracy. But we also know that forms of direct democracy produce their own internal difficulties. So the question is, when you imagine a world beyond, as it were, state capitalism and competitive elitist democracy, what do you imagine?
Okay, let me run through them in order. The first question is, as individuals, what can we do? The answer is practically nothing. What can be done, and always has been done in history, is by people who are organized groups. The labor movement, civil rights movement, women's movement, anti-war movement, environmental movements, these can do things. And that's one of the reasons why powerful systems are so intent on atomizing people. It's very striking. Take there's a lot of propaganda about the wonders of markets. Actually, we only have very limited markets, but there are markets. Markets are supposed to be magnificent because they increase your choices. Actually, they restrict your choices. You think about it for a minute. Suppose I want to get home from work at night. Okay, the market offers me a choice. I can have a Ford or a Toyota. It does not offer me the choice of a Subway, what I want, what's good for me, what's good for the environment, what's good for my children, but that's not offered in the market. Markets offer individual consumption. And the enormous stress on the importance of markets is part of the way to drive people towards looking for yourself, amassing as many commodities as you can, forget everything else. In fact, if you think about it, every one of you has taken an economics course or read about it, then you know what markets are supposed to be. Markets are supposed to be systems in which informed consumers make rational choices, right? I'm sure every one of you has turned on a television set. Now, what do you see when you turn on a television set? You see that there's a huge industry, public relations industry, which began in the United States and Britain, incidentally, huge industry which is designed to undermine markets. Every ad is an attempt to create an uninformed consumer who will make an irrational choice, right? Huge effort on the part of the business world to undermine markets, but to keep the aspect that's useful for profit and power, namely separating people from one another, focusing on individual choices, not working with your neighbor. So to get back to what you can do as an individual, not a lot, except what's always worked in the past and can work in the future. The second question pointed out that the rich and the powerful states act pretty much the same way. Mostly that's true, not entirely. I mentioned the case of Ecuador, which did make an effort to do with its fossil fuels what ought to be done. But by and large, it's doubtless true. That's why I didn't really talk about states when I said that the sectors of the world population that are leading the effort to try to avert the disaster are not states. They're organized groups. They're the indigenous populations. The First Nations in Canada, let's say, are not a state. They're the ones who are trying to stop the tar sands development, which is really lethal. In Australia, the Aboriginal people are very battered and beaten. Those who have survived the onslaught are in the lead in trying to stop the uranium, gold, other mining. In India, there's a war going on with the tribal people trying to protect the reserves from destruction by developmental projects, mining and so on, which will destroy them. But as far as keeping just to countries, it's true that you can't expect states to behave very differently from the way they in fact do under our general kinds of organizations and structures. But of course, what the powerful states do is just a lot more significant. It doesn't matter that much what Ecuador does. It matters a lot what England and the U.S. do. So that's up to us. And that gets to the next question: what about China? China's it's an interesting case. It's a complex case. China gained independence in 1949. From 1949 to 1979, that was roughly the Maoist period. There were a lot of horrors then. Real atrocities took place. A huge famine killed maybe 30, 40 million people. But there are some interesting things that happened that aren't discussed very much. There are interesting studies of comparing China and India. It's an interesting comparison. Attained independence at the same time, two huge countries. They're both very poor. They were pretty similar in 1949, late 40s. And they developed differently during the next 30 years. One of the major studies of this is by a leading economist, Amartya Sen, Nobel laureate in economics, specialist on India. He and his associate, Jean Drèze, an economist in Delhi, very good economist, did a study of mortality in China and India between 1949 and 1979, when China shifted course. Turned out in this period, according to their calculation, 100 million people were killed in democratic capitalist India as compared with China because of what India didn't do. It didn't introduce rural reforms, health clinics, barefoot doctors. In fact, did almost nothing for the peasant population. And the difference in mortality amounts to 100 million people. It's pretty interesting in itself. It's pretty striking, but it's particularly striking because what was happening in the propaganda system. Right at this time, a book came out in France first, then translated into English, called The Black Book of Communism, which is part of the huge propaganda onslaught against how terrible communism was. And yeah, it was pretty terrible, that's true. The book claimed that 100 million people had been killed by communism. Okay? So here you have two studies. One of them says 100 million people were killed by the communists, most of it not based on any data much, just talk. But let's say it's true. Another, a careful study saying that one democratic capitalist country killed 100 million people as compared with China. What was the reaction to the two? The Black Book of Communism, front page reviews all over, articles, everybody knows about it, tells us how horrible communism is. The Sen-Drèze study, I wrote about it. When Amartya Sen got the Nobel Prize, I had a lot of interviews, and I tried to convince journalists to mention it. One did, an Indian journalist actually mentioned it. You're going to look pretty hard to find any reference to it. Well, that's one fact about China. Since China began its shift towards a kind of a, whatever you call it, a state market system, there has been substantial growth. Mortality, on the other hand, is level. Health of the population has not improved, barely improved. So you look at the rates, mortality improved very sharply up till 79, kind of levels off. But there's been a lot of development. China's raised more people out of poverty than the rest of the world combined by a long shot in the last generation or two. And China's busy destroying the environment. They now produce more their emissions rates total emissions are now higher than the U.S. They are making some efforts to cut it back. Like China is the world leader in solar panel production, and not just the mass of it, but even high technology solar panels. But it's a pretty hard slog. China's still a very poor country. There's a lot of talk about China taking over the world and so on. But if you look at the actual measures, say, Human Development Index of the United Nations, China's, I think, around 90th or something. It's an extremely poor country. It has enormous internal problems that the West doesn't have. It's had some spectacular successes. Much of what it's doing is harmful. We can't do much about China. We can do something about ourselves, but I think we should be pretty cautious about the speculations of China become the great superpower of the future. In fact, if you look closely at Chinese exports and ask how much value is added in China, you get quite a different picture of Chinese economic success. So, like, say, an iPhone, if that's exported from China, we call it a Chinese export. But actually, the technology and the high technology and the software and the design mostly come from the peripheral industrial countries, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And China adds the assembly, and the West, of course, which invests in China. I don't remember the numbers offhand, but the figures are very high. The actual value added in China is pretty slight. Well, that's going to increase over the years. China's climbing a technology ladder, but it's not a simple path. And I think we should keep those things in mind. There's some good studies of this. Working at MIT, I don't find a problem with it. I don't have any objection to the fact that people have computers, internet, iPhones, and so on. I don't like the way it's done. It's done very undemocratically. Like, people in the 1950s were not asked, do you want your taxes to go into profits for Apple 30 years from now, and maybe an iPhone for your great-grandchildren? Or do you want your taxes to go into health, education, mass transportation, decent society, and so on? People weren't offered that choice. The choice they were told is, do you want to be destroyed by the Russians or not? And if you don't want to be destroyed by the Russians, put the money into the Pentagon. As Huntington pointed out, that was a misimpression, but it's one that did lead to the economy. However, this has nothing to do with MIT. You know, if I didn't work at MIT, the same thing had happened. I worked there because I think it's a great university. I like it. Never thought of going anywhere else. But I don't see a conflict. In fact, it's kind of the other way around. Being at a place like MIT or being in a country like England, it gives you a chance to influence policy, which you couldn't do if you were elsewhere. That's significant. So if you have a choice of what country to live in and you want to try, if you're interested in making it a better world, the best country to live in is the United States, even if it's maybe the most destructive country in the world, because that's where you can change policy. If you live in, I don't know where, Ecuador, let's say, you can complain about policy, but you can't do much about it. So I don't see that as much of a conflict. What would a democracy look like? Well, my own feeling is that thinking about the various kinds of technical ways in which representation can take place don't really carry us very far. Almost because what really matters is what kind of socioeconomic arrangements are there. Now, here we go back to I think you have to start with something more fundamental. There are plenty of hierarchic relations in society, all kinds, from family to international affairs. I think we should always ask the question, wherever there is such a structure, is it legitimate? And there's a burden of proof. It has to prove its legitimacy. It's not automatically self-legitimating. So wherever there's a structure of authority, domination, hierarchy, patriarchal family, international affairs, anything in between, the question of legitimacy of the structure arises. Sometimes you can justify a structure of dominance, but very rarely. And wherever you can't, it ought to simply be dismantled. And that's across the spectrum. And it can be done in many different ways. So say the feminist revolution of the last roughly generation had a big impact on certain kinds of dominant structures. Okay, that's quite significant. Worker-owned enterprises set the basis up for a different kind of economic and political structure, and they exist. Some of them, in fact, are quite substantial. The Mondragon conglomerate in Spain is, first of all, economically quite successful. It's one of the few parts of the Spanish economy that's going to survive this austerity, devastating austerity policies. But it also is democratic in a way which doesn't show up in method of voting and so on. And I think those are kind of the major factors that have to be looked at. The kinds you mentioned are important, and you could debate exactly how it could be done, but I don't see how any complex system can avoid some sort of representative democracy. We just can't have a vote on everything. But representatives should be accountable, recallable, subject to constant surveillance and control, and interchangeable. And that does have, there can be negative aspects to that, but I can't see how that much can be avoided.
Well, what is there to say now? Noam, thank you. You've made an extraordinary contribution as an academic, as a contribution to linguistics, to philosophy, to public life for a very, very long time. And the fact that you're here today, aged 85, is an extraordinary testament to your vitality and your energy and the number of people that were excited about your visit is really striking. It was the Twitter excitement, the number of times we were asked for tickets. I've never seen so much passion arise when we declared that the tickets are already all gone, and there was fury at the gates of the castle. And that's because everybody wanted to get in to hear you, and we know why. So many, many thanks on behalf of everybody here.